Hello and welcome to today's launch of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. My name is Mike Loader and we begin today by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, traditional custodians of the land where our studio is located. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Now, what makes today so significant is the opportunity for national reform of the clinical trials sector through the implementation of the governance framework. The pandemic has highlighted the need for robust clinical trials to advance new drug development, medical devices and treatments, and ensures the health system is self-improving and sustainable as well. Embedding clinical trial services into the existing clinical and corporate governance systems of health service organisations ensures that clinical trials are undertaken in the most efficient and effective way possible. As many of our launch guests today will comment, a thriving clinical trials environment is essential for a robust healthcare system. Clinical trials provide patients with early access to innovative treatments and interventions and improve the overall standard of medical care provided in Australian hospitals through the uptake of evidence into practice. Today represents the culmination of 4 years of work and the contribution of stakeholders ranging from the state and territory health departments, industry and research networks, to clinician researchers, trial coordinators, health service administrators and national professional bodies. Consumer groups have also been integral to the development of the governance framework and the national consultation process. Joining us for today's launch, we will hear from leaders representing the Australian Government Department of Health and Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, a leading consumer advocate, a health service administrator, a clinician researcher, trial coordinator, industry representative, health service quality officer and chief medical officer of the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. To kick off today's launch, we are fortunate to have someone whose leadership and support on the governance framework has meant we were able to launch today. Here to provide us with a few words to open, we are pleased to welcome the Secretary of the Department of Health, Dr. Brendan Murphy.
Hello, my name is Brendan Murphy. I'm the Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Health. I'm very proud today to launch the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. The governance framework is recognised as a significant reform for the clinical trials sector, developed as a national collaboration with all jurisdictions via the Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, the CTPRG, the Australian Government Department of Health and the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. The CTPRG, under the leadership of Dr. Chris Brook and the Secretariat of the Department, has provided a highly effective mechanism for jurisdictional collaboration and has been instrumental in delivering this governance framework. Chris was very excited to participate in the launch of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, and it is a deep sadness that Chris is unable to be with us for this launch. He unfortunately died on Wednesday, the 4th of May this year. Chris had a distinguished career in medicine and as an advisor to governments on quality and safety in healthcare, and as a past board member of the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. The Governance Framework initiative has been delivered with his driving passion behind it. Chris would welcome being remembered for this important legacy, an important achievement of which he was very proud. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for robust clinical trials to advance new drugs, medical devices and treatments, as well as the need to ensure a self-improving and sustainable health system. The Australian Government is the most significant investor in the health and medical research sector to improve the health outcomes and develop Australia as a global destination for medical sector jobs, research and clinical trials. Investment by the health and medical research sector contributes approximately $1.4 billion to the research and development economy. All Australian governments are continuing to progress the clinical trial reform agenda to strengthen Australia's clinical trial sector through the CTPRG. A number of policy initiatives have underpinned the recent improvements to the sector via the Revitalised Clinical Trials agenda. The Encouraging More Clinical Trials in Australia initiative aims at supporting jurisdictions in redesigning clinical trial operations, and jurisdictions in the Commonwealth are collaborating on key measures to address priority action areas, including the coordination units to centralise and coordinate trial management, networks and partnerships to maximise collaboration with trial networks, communities of expertise, practice and registries with an emphasis on cross-jurisdictional and discipline cooperation, enhancement of data and knowledge systems, embedding research and clinical trials into core hospital governance arrangements, embedding clinical trials in safety and quality in systems, and finally, approaches to improving national infrastructure. The development and implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework is a key element of the Revitalised Clinical Trials Agenda, delivered through Encouraging More Clinical Trials in Australia program. Under the national budget of 2021-22, a further $6 million was invested to enhance Australia's status as a leading option to conduct clinical trials by continuing the Encouraging More Clinical Trials in Australia program, and a further investment of $125 million via the Rural, Regional and Remote Clinical Trial Enabling Infrastructure program was invested. The focus of this funding is to improve the health of Australians in rural, remote and regional areas through access to innovative clinical trials by removing the many barriers to participating in clinical trials. It's anticipated this will be achieved by improving facilities, equipment and services in rural, regional and remote Australia, providing patients quicker and easier access to medical treatments, drugs, therapies and devices through participation in clinical trials, increasing research capacity, enhancing local and national organisations, facilities and the workforce. These effects are expected to be realised within health service organisations that deliver clinical trials. The governance framework embeds clinical trials into routine health service provision and strengthens the clinical and corporate governance arrangements for governments, hospital administrators, health services, private companies, trial sponsors and trial investigators that actually deliver the trials. Importantly, it will do so in a way that will reduce duplication and increase efficiency, cohesion and productivity across the clinical trials sector. The goal is ultimately to make Australia a preferred destination for clinical trials to benefit participants and stimulate jobs and business growth arising from health and medical research. The costs of delays in clinical trial startup impact on clinical trial budgets and are frequently related to strategic and operational barriers. Improved organisational governance of trial services enables health administrators to oversight trial operations, determine workforce arrangements and optimise organisational strategic planning to deliver those clinical trial services. It is anticipated that embedding clinical trial services into routine practices of health service organisations will deliver measurable operational efficiencies across multiple therapeutic areas delivering clinical trial services. Accreditation to the actions within the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework will remove barriers to things like the pre-trial assessments of a trial site, pre-recruitment activities such as ethical assessments and approval timeframes, recruitment activities and trial management, workforce training and engagement, and trial-related business and financial management. Following agreement by all jurisdictions earlier this year, the sector greatly anticipates the implementation of the governance framework under the Australian Health Service Safety and Quality Accreditation Scheme in the latter half of this year.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy, the Secretary of the Department of Health there, joining us. And over the page and joining us in the studio now is Professor Irwin Loh, the National Chief Medical Officer and Group General Manager of Clinical Governance for St Vincent's Health Australia, the nation's largest not-for-profit health and aged care provider. He was also pivotal in bringing to fruition the governance framework, and it is fitting that he is participating in today's launch. Professor Loh, welcome to the program.
Hi Mike, it's great to be here.
Now this is an exciting one. I understand you had quite a role when it came to jumping on board and putting together the framework. Can you take us through your input when it came to the governance framework?
Sure. So I was a member of the original National Clinical Trials Governance Framework Steering Committee that actually developed the framework in the first place.
Right.
And then I was very fortunate enough to be the deputy chair of the Phase 2 Steering Committee, the body that oversaw the implementation of the pilot program.
Okay, so how's this framework going to benefit those conducting clinical trials, I suppose those who are on the front line?
The framework's going to be of enormous benefit.
Okay.
Because basically what it does is that it sets the minimum standards for both public and private hospitals so that they know what's required to run high quality clinical trials. This means that researchers, clinical trialists, not only get the resources required, the manpower, equipment, infrastructure needed to run trials, but it also means that hospitals are able to provide those resources to them in order to run the trials that they need to run.
Sort of open the gates, so to speak.
Yeah. So everyone knows what's expected.
There you go, a bit of a VIP sort of service there. It's an interesting one. So, as the Chief Medical Officer of a major hospital, are you excited by this framework? And I suppose, how will it affect other executives across the hospital system as well? It seems like such an exciting and big initiative.
I think executives are going to be benefiting from the framework because they will know now exactly what's required to ensure that their facilities are able to support high quality clinical trials. They'll know what is required in terms of budget so that they can plan financially, but also it means that people who run hospitals like myself can go to governments, to external funders, and to philanthropists to ask for funding and support in order to run those trials as well.
Okay, so based on what we've talked about so far, do you think this will encourage other hospitals to jump on board and get involved?
I think so. I think this basically sets the minimum standards and requirements required to run trials, which means that hospital CEOs and state departments will be able to know which hospitals are able to do this. And if hospitals are too small and don't have the resources, they are also able to partner with larger health services in order to run those trials.
Okay, so teaming up to
Yeah.
for the greater good.
Correct.
Yeah. So, can you talk to us how the framework will allow hospitals to continually, I suppose, improve upon their clinical trials? There's leg room for improvement there, based on what we've established.
Yeah. So hospitals should be able to look at the framework and use that to build, to develop, and to improve the processes they already have to support research and trials in their organizations. So the idea here is that the framework is not merely a checklist for people to check off, but it provides them a way to continuously improve the research culture and environment for their researchers.
Professor Loh, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today and discussing your involvement in all of this excitement.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure.
To my next guest now, and Nicole Rasmussen is the Director of Patient Safety and Improvement, Clinical Governance for Alfred Health in Victoria, and has been a strong advocate for patient safeguards and protections as the new governance structure was formed. She joins us now in the studio to talk about today's launch. Nicole, welcome to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi Mike, pleased to be here.
First up, I want to know a little bit about your input when it came to putting together this exciting new framework that is going to hopefully change the game a little bit.
Sure. So I was invited by the Commission to join the Clinical Trials Advisory Committee, and my role on that committee was really providing a perspective from a quality and safety and patients and risk perspective really within the development of the framework.
Very important things when you're putting something like this together within the framework. Let's talk about the perspective of your patients, and do you think the framework will increase access to clinical trials ongoing?
Yes, I do. I think it will be a critical element moving forward for clinical trials. I think in terms of increasing accessibility for patients within both frameworks, both the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards as well as the Clinical Trials Governance Framework, they both promote the clinical trials being a core function of hospitals and health services. And part of those frameworks is also having robust mechanisms for communicating with patients and with the community. And the communication around the clinical trial services that are available, as well as the clinical trials that are underway, will go a long way in terms of increasing their awareness and then accessibility to clinical trials.
And hopefully involvement as well and participation.
Involvement, and then ultimately it's around improving patient outcomes. And so, I think it'll go a long way.
Fantastic. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you think the framework will help the health sector undertake clinical trials themselves.
Yes, absolutely. So I think within the framework, it promotes strong clinical governance and quality and safety processes. Within clinical trial services, there are already existing processes, so it's really the focus is around strengthening those. But the important next step is around integrating those with the broader health service or organisational, corporate and clinical governance processes. Now, the benefit of that is that that then raises the profile of clinical trial services, and importantly, the role of and the support that's available then for the clinical, the research teams. So I think that's, yeah.
It truly sounds like a united front when you sort of break it down like
well,
that.
I make it sound easy, and there's obviously work to do, but you know, there's many health services have got a very strong foundation. So it's really building from the work that's in place around the National Safety and Quality Health Service standards, because they're very clearly aligned to the clinical trials governance framework. So
well, let's talk a little bit about that and the why it's important to integrate clinical trial services into health service organisations as well.
Sure. So I mentioned before about clinical trials being a core function of health services. And in order for it to be core, it needs to be integrated as part of clinical care delivery. So the benefit of it being integrated, again, as I mentioned before, it raises the profile, it increases the visibility and the transparency around clinical trials, the health outcomes of patients, and importantly, the continuous improvement of those clinical trial services. From a patient perspective, however, that integration is absolutely critical. We don't want siloed clinical trials, participation in clinical trial over here, but actually my whole care plan is sitting here with another team. We really need them to be connected, we need to be integrated, coordinated, and really keeping the patient at the centre of their care plan.
Absolutely. A wonderful rundown from you, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks for your time, Mike. Lovely to meet you.
Over the page now, an Associate Professor Lewis Campbell currently works at the Intensive Care Ward, Royal Darwin Hospital. The Associate Professor does research in anaesthetics, internal medicine and clinical trials, and he joins us now to talk about the breakthrough this will mean for clinical research in Australia. Lewis Campbell, thank you so much for joining us for today's launch. Let's start. Can you tell us about your role in the development of the framework?
My involvement with the framework was initially as a member of the Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, representing the Northern Territory on that. Once the framework had been designed, actually the Royal Darwin Hospital was one of the pilot sites, and so I participated as one of the principal investigators as part of that.
Professor Campbell, do you think the governance framework will help people and organisations undertake clinical trials that haven't before done so? And I guess if so, how?
Clinical trials in Australia are going to benefit from the framework because we're able to utilise the lessons that have been learned, the professionalism that's been learned from high volume sites, and roll that out across the entire of Australia, giving trialists and scientists and public health physicians the confidence that Australia can deliver trials quickly to meet population needs.
Okay, so the governance framework is going to better provide organisations with the means to conduct trials, but patients are also going to have better access to those trials, aren't they? Can you speak about that a little bit more?
That's right. Patient access will also increase because the proportion of the Australian population that's currently covered by clinical trials active sites will increase remarkably under this framework. It'll mean that patients will have the access to clinical trials that are of high validity and reliability and enable them to take part in trials that will influence their own care and the care of every future patient.
How do you think investigators such as yourself will benefit from the governance framework? And I guess, what are you most excited about as well?
Clinicians will definitely benefit from the framework. I'm most excited by being able to deliver high quality, personalised care as soon as the evidence is generated and available. The ability to coordinate complex interventions with complex components and multidisciplinary teams is only going to be increased by having trials embedded as routine care.
And what about the patients themselves? Will trials be of higher quality for them undergoing treatment, etc.?
Definitely. Where trials are routine, usual healthcare, the proportion of the healthcare system that is familiar with the treatments and familiar with how to deliver them safely will increase. Trials are the safest form of healthcare because of the steps that have been gone through to define standard care, and it'll bring that high safety and reliability to all of healthcare.
Professor Campbell, do you think the framework will get the treatments to Australian patients quicker? Is that something we can look forward to?
Ultimately, I do think the framework will help get treatments to Australian patients quicker, because embedding it in routine care means that all patients will have access to it faster. Having conducted the trials in Australia, we have instant confirmation of validity, so we can simply port those high quality results to routine care.
Okay, so before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to add just before I let you go?
Yeah, before we finish, I think that this process that seems inevitable and simply a product of common sense just now seemed impossible before the leadership of the Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, which is due to Professor Chris Brook, who until his untimely death some days ago led the group through years of careful and considered reform of the entire clinical trials landscape. Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for your time, Associate Professor Lewis Campbell. Thanks again for joining us. Sue Brew is a clinical trial coordinator at Canberra Hospital. Sue is responsible for coordinating conduct and management of designated clinical trials and research projects within the hospital, and we are fortunate enough to have her join us to add her unique perspective for today's launch. Welcome to the program, Sue. Sue, can you provide us with some insights about the role you played in bringing the framework together, just to start?
Canberra Hospital was involved in the pilot of the governance framework, and I participated in the consultation process during the final stages of its development phase. Across all parts of the health sector, research, including clinical trials, has previously existed outside of the core service planning and resourcing. The National Clinical Trials Governance Framework seeks to bring it inside the remit of Health Service Administration as part of core service delivery, to be assessed as part of the service accreditation.
Okay, so what is your role within the clinical trials process?
My involvement in clinical trials process is as a clinical trial coordinator, and I've been working in this job for about 25 years. I'm part of a multidisciplinary team engaged in the management of clinical trials within a hospital-based oncology service. I work with a team of health professionals, research officers and trial sponsors to ensure that data is of a high standard and readily available, and that the research is conducted strictly in accordance with ethical, regulatory and legal conditions. I've consistently worked directly with patients, coordinating their care on clinical trials to ensure the protocol is followed and all the required data is collected. But there are now many diverse responsibilities within a clinical research team. These include specialised roles such as trial-specific laboratory staff, data managers, finance and business managers, all working as a team to maintain and sustain and develop the capacity to conduct quality clinical research.
So, what does the framework mean to you in the health sector specifically?
As a trial coordinator, the framework means health services consider clinical trial services in health system planning and delivery. Accreditation to the governance framework ensures that clinical trial teams are supported to deliver clinical trials, and there is infrastructure in place to support safe and high quality service provision. This infrastructure includes things like dedicated space, equipment, IT support and a stable and skilled workforce. In turn, this will improve our capacity to conduct not only commercially sponsored clinical trials that have a considerable economic benefit, but also to conduct investigator-driven trials that provide the evidence for ongoing innovation in healthcare more generally. Planning for and supporting this infrastructure will no longer be a separate, siloed and optional in the Health Service Administration.
Right. And for hospital executives and healthcare professionals, is the framework going to have a big impact? Is it safe to say?
The framework is going to have an important impact for hospital executives and healthcare professionals, because it will no longer be acceptable for clinical trials to operate as siloed or separate activities. For the first time, clinical trial services will be considered a part of routine hospital business. Hospitals will need to demonstrate that they are able to retain a skilled and reliable workforce, and this will mean more reliable clinical trial service provision.
Sue, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program today and unpacking all about your involvement and the future ahead.
Thanks, Mike. Great to speak with you.
Joining us now is Anne McKenzie, a Senior Consumer Representative for Consumers Health Forum of Australia and former Chair of Health Consumers Council WA. As the key consumer advocate that helped to oversee the development of the governance framework, could you please tell us about your leadership on consumer advocacy and how this helped with the framework on the whole?
I was recommended to the Commission because I've been a consumer advocate across Australia for almost 30 years. I'm also a consumer director on the board of the Australasian Clinical Trials Alliance, making sure patients have a voice and at the heart of research and clinical trials in Australia has been a significant part of my career for the past 2 decades.
Okay, from your perspective as a consumer advocate, how important is the launch of the governance framework to you and Australian patients as well?
The launch of the framework is incredibly important to Australian consumers because there's an expectation from patients, and rightfully so, that the medical services they receive are of the highest standard, and this includes clinical trials. The framework, which has taken 5 years to develop, will give patients confidence that health services and treatments are accredited. They meet the high standards of care and they are transparent, and most importantly, they continuously improve.
Okay, so are there any other audiences that you think need to know about the framework specifically?
Researchers, clinical experts, as well as patients can all have real confidence that clinical trials taking place in Australia are world leading and that everyone involved will be supported in doing them.
So, Anne, this puts Australia on the map, doesn't it? From the perspective of the quality of research being done here. Am I right?
I believe the framework will definitely put Australia on the map because the sponsors of trials and researchers will want to come here because they'll be assured that the safety and quality of research done in Australia is guaranteed. Every hospital conducting a clinical trial is accredited, able to do the research and ultimately help get the treatment into the hands of patients sooner.
Okay, Anne, I'm going to ask you a personal one. What does the launch of the framework mean to you?
I think it's a really great step forward in the delivery of high quality care to Australian patients.
Well, before we let you go, is there anything you'd like to say to the health professionals attending the launch of the framework?
I'm very privileged to have been part of this project, and now seeing it being delivered is very exciting.
Well said. Anne McKenzie, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Be well.
Thanks, Mike. It's been great to speak with you.
Next up on today's launch, we have Helen Ornetti, who is the Country Head of Clinical Operations at Roche Australia. Helen was the industry representative on the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework Committee and is joining us now to provide us with some insights on how today's launch will help spearhead industry support of Australian-based clinical trials. Welcome to you, Helen. So first up, Helen, how did your role allow you to provide input into the framework?
During the development of the framework, I was the industry representative on both advisory committees, participated in the consultation process and also the framework pilots. I represented the Research and Development Task Force, which is a group with members from Medicines Australia, AusBiotech and the medical device organisation, the MTAA. So during this time, since 2018, I was responsible for sharing comments and feedback in the development of the framework and participating in various consultation and presentations.
So how significant is the framework for the clinical trials sector, I suppose, is my next question.
The framework is of tremendous importance to clinical trials in Australia because it's the first significant development in some time towards the development of a national approach to embedding clinical trials in health services through a national accreditation scheme. Australia has a great reputation in clinical research. However, what we have found with our states and territories is some fragmentation and also inefficiencies in how we do clinical trials. The framework will enable better coordination and provide clarity for a national way and framework and process to conduct clinical trials in our sector in Australia.
So, as an industry representative, why should pharmaceutical companies and other industry players be excited about this new framework, if you can break it down for us?
The medical sector should be extremely excited about the new framework because it is our goal to bring possible clinical trial treatments to Australian patients. The framework, we believe, will improve efficiency, will improve productivity, will provide better clarity to sponsors in how we conduct clinical research in our country. It's the first directional step towards a national approach to clinical trials, and we believe that the framework will complement some of the work being done by the One Stop Clinical Shop.
So, Helen, how do you think different stakeholders in the medical space are going to benefit from the framework?
Sectors from the medical space are going to benefit from this framework because it provides consistent clarity in how to embed clinical trials in health service provision. So we know that the framework and standards are very common and familiar to all our hospital systems, and this will just provide an additional tool for particularly hospitals, for researchers, for academics, for site coordinators in how we conduct clinical trials, and also provide clarity to sponsors and patients in terms of how we select our clinical trials, in how we conduct our clinical trials, in terms of operational strategies, in terms of trials and budgets, and more importantly in how we train and educate our workforce to support the clinical trial sector.
Wonderful stuff from you, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us on today's launch. Helen Ornetti, the Country Head of Clinical Operations at Roche Australia there. Now, the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare has been responsible for leading, coordinating and supporting the development of the governance framework. Central to this role has been the leadership of Professor Anne Duggan, Chief Medical Officer at the Commission. Professor Duggan has made her career to support important reforms to Australia's health system, like the one we are launching today. We are grateful to have Professor Duggan provide us with this statement for today's launch. Take a look.
On behalf of the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, I would like to thank everyone for attending the launch of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. The National Clinical Trials Governance Framework is the first step towards embedding clinical trials into routine health service provision and strengthening clinical and corporate governance. The aims of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework are to support the delivery of high-quality clinical trial services and to ensure that clinical trials are conducted in a safe environment and that clinical trial services are continually improving. The National Clinical Trials Governance Framework describes the actions that are essential for health service organisations to achieve integrated corporate and clinical governance systems for clinical trial services as core business under the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards. It doesn't specify how a health service organisation or trial site should develop or implement its governance systems. Rather, it describes the systems and processes that should be in place for effective clinical trials governance with consideration of local needs, values and the context in which services are provided. The outcome of trial site accreditation to a national quality standard will be consistency in trial start-up time, optimised pre-approval and recruitment timeframes and improved collaboration within health service organisations. For the first 3-year accreditation cycle, health service organisations will be assessed against a maturity scale. That is, health service organisation will be assessed as either having established systems, growing systems or initial systems in place to meet the actions as provided in the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework for clinical trial service provision. This will give health service organisations one full accreditation cycle or 3 years to implement the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. Beyond the first 3 years, health service organisations will transition fully to the assessment of their clinical trial services under the Australian Health Service Safety and Quality Accreditation Scheme and be assessed as either having met or not met the actions within the NSQHS standards clinical governance standard and partnering with consumer standard for clinical trial service provision, and if not met, receive 90 days to remediate.
Professor Anne Duggan, thank you so much for your time today. And well, that wraps up today's launch. There's been a lot of ground covered, and I think you will agree the governance framework will be transformative for clinical trial service provision in Australia. Thank you to our leaders and representatives for speaking with us today, and thank you to all the stakeholders who have contributed to developing and finalising the governance framework. We would especially like to recognise the state and federal governments who have championed and supported this initiative. Now, if you'd like to learn more, we have extended interview clips available on request from the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare website at www.safetyandquality.gov.au. There you will also find a link where you can rewatch today's launch as well. My name is Mike Loader. I want to thank you all for your time. Have a great day.